During the dumpster fire that has been the year 2020, I've found great comfort in finding and collecting older games that have been somewhere on my radar for a long time. It's been a decent way of doing away with the dread of existing in the United States nowadays, and it's been a good excuse to stay indoors and stick to social distancing. However, even video games can't fix all of my quarantine boredom, at least not directly. In gathering up all of these renowned games with well-established fan bases, I found myself in an incredibly unique position when it comes to critiquing them. Why not endeavor to examine these games from the perspective of a newcomer? How do they hold up generations after their release? What is it like jumping into a fandom that so many have already come to call home? Can I recommend the experience to other potential newcomers? With all these questions in mind, I set out to take on the newcomer experience and relay it to the gaming community, with the hope that I can provide some entertainment for the newbies like myself, and extend the conversation to the vets who know these games like the backs of their hands. And so, I present my nostalgia-free review of Kingdom Hearts on the PS2 and PS4. Spoilers ahead. Despite this game being so famous and popular, and despite knowing of it for just about my entire gaming life, and despite starting it so close to the release of Kingdom Hearts 3, I still knew next to nothing about Kingdom Hearts. If someone were to put a gun to my head before I started and told me to say what the game was about, I'd be supremely dead. All I knew was that you play as a small child named Sora, he has a harmless looking weapon called a Keyblade, and Epic Mickey. Deep down, I think I knew that Final Fantasy was involved, and I think I knew that you could fight Sephiroth, but I also didn't know shit about Final Fantasy, so I don't think that really counts. Kingdom Hearts is actually a JRPG crossover of Square's Final Fantasy characters and the extended Disney pantheon, because the two just go together like fire and gunpowder. All joking aside, turning Disney into anime is strangely fun, even if it's one of the weirdest things I've ever heard. But it's the weirdness of the whole thing that attracted me to the game in the first place. While most people would likely be put off by stories of how batshit the game gets, and how it makes no sense, and how even by anime standards it's really wacky, I ain't most people. I knew that playing Kingdom Hearts would lead to one of two things: an indescribably engaging and hype gaming experience, or something at the very least really entertaining. Generally, a game's intro should introduce the player to the game's structure and mechanics in a safe and secure environment. That way, when the game's challenge gets serious later on, you're already comfortable and prepared to move ahead. Kingdom Hearts takes an interesting approach to this concept. Rather than providing one easy environment for the player to learn the systems, it divides itself into 3 different sections. Sora's Dream teaches the basic controls, Destiny Island teaches the completion of objectives and combat through combat scenarios that the player can pursue at their own discretion, and Traverse Town teaches exploration. In dividing the game's systems into clean and discrete sections, it doesn't so much as lay a foundation for what the game is going to be, but rather makes a simple and charming playground that eases the player into its strange phantasmagoria. If there were 2 words that I could use to describe this intro, I'd say that they're simple and clean. In some ways, this works in the game's favor. However, as much of the game projects much of its best qualities through this method, it also projects some of its greatest flaws by dividing players' attention so thin. Each of the 3 sections excels in a different way, but contributes to foreshadowing the game's greater problems in their own way as well. Sora's Dream, for example, excellently establishes tone with a certain degree of childlike charm. Sora's design and animation is perfect. Starting out with a dark environment that completely contrasts with Sora's bright and cheery design and disposition accentuates its charming nature perfectly. The environment doesn't detract from the experience because, while it's dark and foreboding, it's not very realistic. Through all the darkness, there's always a pervading sense of silliness and cartoonishness. However, while it's not terribly realistic, it still lets you know that the game is going to take itself a little seriously, which, whether that's an aspect you like about the game or not, it's undoubtedly important to establish this early on. I couldn't even be mad about the game taking itself seriously when Yoko Shimomura's score is as good as it is. The kind of scale that this first segment sets up is admittedly intriguing, making for exactly the kind of experience I was hoping for with such a prolific game. Even if the tone winds up shooting the game in the foot at points through its self-serious narrative, I gotta say, it really got me in the mood to keep going at the start. However, like I said, each section of this intro establishes both something the game is going to excel at and something that's going to whiff on entirely. I appreciate the way it establishes a killer combo of charming aesthetics and serious scale threats, but in this instance, the failure comes in the very thing it's teaching. Generally, when I start an RPG, I always have a fear that it's just going to be too complicated and completely chase me away from playing any further. In this case, though, I had the exact opposite reaction. I wound up thinking, is this a little too simple? We're not at the point where I'm going to talk about combat yet, but just keep in mind that there is such a thing as too simple of a system. After Sora's Dream, we move on to Destiny Islands, and the actual plot finally begins. Before I get into how Destiny Islands works as part of the intro, I should talk a little bit about the main trio of Sora, Riku, and Kairi. Sora works well as a player character despite his lack of depth. His desires are meant to reflect those of the player. He wants to adventure because the player taking the reins here would naturally want to adventure. He wants to become powerful enough to face his enemies because fighting enemies is fun for the player. He wants to save the cute girl because this game is aimed at pubescent boys and all women are queens, even when they laugh like small children. You guys, sure you didn't want to try another take there? But anyways, in that sense, I think Sora's lack of real character depth works to the game's benefit. He instead serves the purpose of allowing the player to project themselves onto him. What's more important is his relationship with the other characters. With Riku, I think it's safe to say that his eventual descent into villainhood is pretty apparent from the word go. I may not know shit about Final Fantasy, but I know that white hair and a cocky grin means that you're a bad guy and beating you halfway to hell is probably going to be really satisfying. I don't care how big your Mickey Mouse shoes are, you're a bad guy. Keeping that in mind, Riku is built up as a sort of mirrored image of Sora. He loves adventuring like Sora, and he heavily thirsts after the only female in a 5-island radius, except for the actual small child like Sora, but he has fewer moral boundaries that would prevent him from chasing after his desires. He's older and lacks Sora's blind idealism, making him an interesting foil. Kairi adds nothing to the character dynamics, save for being an object for Sora and Riku to chase. I guess she's kind of sassy and playful, but it's difficult to tell exactly what makes her a good love interest for Sora, or Riku for that matter. The only thing I could come up with is that she's mysterious? As the game progresses, more questions are raised about Kairi's home, as it's established that she wasn't born on Destiny Islands and arrived there during a storm. It would appear that Kairi represents the mystery of the world beyond Destiny Islands and the thrill of adventure. The only thing is, she doesn't represent that, her backstory does. Kairi is kind of indifferent about where she came from, and she seems the least into the prospect of adventuring. It always just seems like she exists. I appreciate the lengths the game goes to prove that Sora and Kairi do have a genuine bond that extends farther than her bond with Riku, but her lack of significant dynamic contribution always makes her feel out of place when she's instrumental in a given scene. It's a shame because she winds up not being a damsel in distress for the whole game and has some pivotal moments that drastically affect the whole series. It'd be nice if her personality were more complex than what a young child's quirky dream girl would be like, but I guess the game does kind of have an audience to appeal to. Still, I can't help but want more for her. Moving back to the topic of how Destiny Islands works as a tutorial, I actually feel like it's the most solid of the three. You have to collect a grocery list of items for the trio's raft in progress in order to progress, but you're free to take your time and practice the game's combat first. Talking with Sora's friends on the island, Tidus, Selphie, Waka, and even Riku, gives Sora the option to face them in one-on-one duels. Beating all of the first three unlocks a fight against all of them at the same time, but the main attraction here is still fighting Riku. Every time you lose against Riku, Sora dejectedly recites the tally of wins and losses. You don't get anything for finishing Destiny Islands with more wins than losses, but you don't need a reward. The satisfaction of beating Riku is a reward unto itself. The notion of Riku being your rival is so effectively and efficiently set up that you're practically bursting with anticipation, waiting for this asshat to go bad so you can kick his weirdly perfect teeth in. Why is the dental so good on this island? Where are you getting the silver for your chains? I'm off topic. As much as this section primes you with the combat options, it also primes your desire for adventure. No, I don't mean through the weird conversations between the main trio. I mean with the foreshadowing of Ansem, our main antagonist. While it is neat that we get a peek at the main villain so early, it's also a great showcase for the mystery that lies beyond the shores and the desire to understand the ways of the universe. It really drives home the point that Kairi doesn't add much in terms of character to the story and need to be more unique and engaging. The option to engage in combat or breeze through the area makes Destiny Islands really stand out as a great tutorial area. Great, but not perfect. There's just one issue that again foreshadows a greater problem down the line. One of the items on your list is a coconut. Sounds easy. Whack a tree, watch coconut fall out, pick it up, done, right? Wrong. You see, that coconut isn't a coconut. I know it looks like a coconut. I know it matches every conceivable notion of what a coconut is, but it's not a coconut. You see, you have to keep hitting the tree until this thing falls. That's a coconut. I know it doesn't look as much like a cartoon coconut as the other one, but trust me, that's a coconut. This kind of confusion isn't hard to clear up for the player. Just have Kairi say that she needs a green coconut. However, by not making this clarification, the player is bound to think the game is messing up for a considerable time before eventually they stumble upon the right answer. This might seem like a minor annoyance now, but trust me, it becomes a lot more of a running theme. Before getting into Traverse Town, I want to give the Disney duo the same treatment I gave to the human teens. That said, not much is required when it comes to introducing Donald and Goofy. These are timeless characters that we all know right from the outset. There is the issue of how they're introduced, however. If introduced incorrectly, the whole tone of the game can be thrown out of whack. I call this the Sonic 06 effect. Picture it now, a bunch of human anime characters in a weirdly serious setting, and then boom, in comes Dr. Robotnik and Sonic the goddamn Hedgehog. It's pretty clear how this kills the atmosphere. Fortunately, Kingdom Hearts circumvents this by introducing the Disney characters in isolation. By giving them time to exist on their own, it doesn't come off as strange when they suddenly exist alongside Sora. This is accented in Traverse Town when Donald and Goofy constantly enter the area as soon as you leave, subtly leaning you into accepting the idea that these characters can all inhabit the same space. It also builds suspense as the player begins to toy with their own exploration. Traverse Town is the first area that presents some genuine challenge to the player in that there's real adversity and dying means facing the game over screen. This can happen at the end of Destiny Islands, but it probably won't because it's just really easy. As long as you have a reaction time of about 1 hour, you'll be fine. What makes it really cool is that the amount of adversity you face is up to you. There's a great risk-reward system with this form of gameplay. For example, if you walk into the clock tower, you'll be faced with a long, intense wave battle against shadows, but winning means plenty of XP to rise above future challenges. The fight against Squall,
that's Leon,
that happens midway through this area is difficult, but facing the tougher challenges earlier in the level through exploration means potentially being strong enough to beat him. However, if you lose, the story progresses. Again, there is no special reward for winning this fight, but the game recognizes that the triumph is the real reward, as it proves that your exploration and training paid off. The problem with exploration in Traverse Town is that it's not entirely in your hands when you stop exploring. In order to get to that fight against Squallon and progress, you have to head back to the town square and check in at the accessory shop with Sid, despite the game never prompting you to do anything of the sort. The lack of direction is the issue that comes to permeate through most of the game, whether it's a lack of clarity on where you're supposed to go, or a lack of feedback that you're on the right or wrong track. The game has serious issues when it comes to proceeding along its own path. The final battle here is undoubtedly satisfying, and Sora, Donald, and Goofy joining forces feels earned, but by the time Traverse Town ends, it becomes abundantly clear that the trip to the end of the game won't be quite as smooth as Donald's wonderfully oversized beak. Sora, Donald, and Goofy decide to travel together since Donald and Goofy were ordered by King Mickey to stay with the Keyblade wielder, and Sora needs a ride so he can search for Riku and Kairi. So the crew jumps into Donald and Goofy's gummy ship and sets out to blindly explore Disney World until something happens. Before I get into the Disney Worlds, allow me to quickly bring up the gummy ship segments. They're fine. I honestly think these sections get a little bit of a bad rep. It's definitely a little frustrating whenever you open up a chest only to find gummy ship pieces that don't actually help you where it counts, but the levels themselves are mindlessly entertaining rail shooters that don't detract from the game at all, even if they don't really add anything either. As for how the Disney worlds fit into the story, I was actually surprised to find some pretty solid integration here. Each world retells the story of the movie it's based upon, at least to some extent. Sometimes it's a pretty complete retelling, like in Agrabah. Other times it's simplified, like with Monstro. Admittedly, the characters don't always have a very good reason for staying in the worlds. Typically they stay so they can help someone in need, or because there's a clue that Riku, Kairi, or King Mickey have been there. But occasionally there are worlds they stay in, just cuz. Such is the case with Atlantica and Halloween Town. However, despite some shallow reasoning for staying in the worlds, the ways that each world, except for the previously mentioned two, makes itself relevant in the overall plot is kinda cool. 3 plot threads progress as Sora, Donald, and Goofy travel to different worlds. The first is the mystery of what the Alliance of Disney villains is up to. Atlantica and Halloween Town kind of apply for this one since Ursula and Oogie Boogie are part of the Sinister team, but their plans have nothing to do with anything. Ursula wants to rule the seas and Oogie Boogie wants to control the Heartless, and neither of those goals really coincide with opening Kingdom Hearts and achieving Supreme Darkness, so in the end the whole arc of trying to make the Heartless dance for no good reason is just a waste of time. Seriously, Sora, you know by this point Kairi could be in genuine danger. Why do you want to waste so much time making the Heartless dance? I didn't sign up for this. The real meat and potatoes of the villain's plan is the kidnapping of various princesses. It's neat how Alice goes missing first without any answers as to who took her, only for it to be revealed later on that it was the villains. Since that's set up early on, when you go to Agrabah to find that Jafar is looking for Jasmine, you immediately know it's at stake. It makes for a crushing blow when she's taken anyway and feeds nicely into the second plot thread, i.e., Riku's descent into villainhood. Riku pops back into the story after just a few worlds, but it's soon revealed that Maleficent is in his ear sowing doubts about how much Sora really cares about him and Kairi. I really enjoyed watching Sora and Riku's relationship get progressively worse. When you meet him in Neverland approaching the game's final act, he's finally gone full villain, making for a pretty smooth transition overall. His desperation to save Kairi results in a gradual vanishing of his morality, and his competitiveness with Sora leads to a rising ego. I genuinely love watching this change. The final story thread, and arguably the most important, is the growing friendship between Sora, Donald, and Goofy. The trio don't particularly like each other at the start. Donald lies to Sora, or rather gives off a misleading confidence in order to get him to travel with them as per their king's orders, and therefore solely in his and Goofy's best interest. They then start to butt heads whenever Sora's interests ever conflict with Donald's. Goofy winds up being more of a referee, but the conflict is still present. Many worlds that don't contribute much to the other plot threads, like Olympus Coliseum and Deep Jungle, and even some of the worlds that do, like Neverland, build the friendship between these three, culminating in an all-important climax at Hollow Bastion, but we'll get to that later. The point is, despite the worlds often serving as retellings of the films they're based upon, there's a decent chunk of KH-specific story that does branch through most of them. In fact, levels sometimes build on relationships between Sora and Kairi too. My favorite Kairi moment is one where Sora thinks about how excited he is to tell her that he flew in Neverland. My favorite Kairi moment is one that she isn't in. Really goes to show ya. Apart from all that, each world often has level-specific features that make them even more unique. Wonderland has a central room that you interact with in various ways as you solve puzzles throughout the level. Olympus Coliseum has a wave-based minigame that allows you to easily grind for XP as well as fight bonus bosses like the Final Fantasy crew and Titans. Deep Jungle has a vine surfing minigame. Agrabah has an interconnected multi-level dungeon to loot in the Cave of Wonders. Monstro serves as a more maze-like level that opens up when you gain more abilities like the high jump and glide moves. Halloween Town completely changes in aesthetics to capitalize on the film's personal animation style. Neverland has locked doors that require exploration to get around. Atlantica has the swimming system and... Look, I didn't say they were all good. I appreciate that changing worlds affects more than what enemies you'll come across. There's something new to do or interact with in each one, keeping the game's pacing from getting too slow. Something else to keep the worlds fresh is the characters within them, plus the familiar yet pleasing musical compositions by the incomparable Yoko Shimomura. Many of the original voice actors for the Disney characters like Jodie Benson, Pat Carroll, Jonathan Freeman, Gilbert Gottfried, Tress MacNeille, James Woods, and more return to reprise their roles here. Even the impersonators who voice the others do a good job, save for Dan Castellaneta, but in fairness, I've never liked Homer Genie. The voices on these characters help rope the players into the worlds, and their animations are stellar. In terms of variety and atmosphere, these levels all prove to work wonders. It's just a shame they aren't better designed. Yes, in spite of all the beautiful scenery and flourish that these worlds have, they can often be quite the pain to get through. Don't get me wrong, this game is fun, it's just also obscenely frustrating. To fully grasp the severity of the game's lack of direction, look no further than Deep Jungle. It starts out alright with a clear path down to the human camp where you reconvene with Dawn and Goofy, as well as Jane and Clayton. After some slide hunting, Clayton convinces Tarzan to lead you to Kerchak, which he doesn't do. But okay, that's fine. Using a little bit of player intuition, it's not hard to figure out that Kerchak and the gorillas are going to be in the trees, so it'd probably be best to head there. You meet Kerchak, and Tarzan begs in vain for help before the game points you in the direction of the treehouse you started in. Unfortunately, telling you where to go means nothing if you've been told nothing about how to get there. Well, okay, there are these swinging vines here that the game just told me how to use, so I bet the treehouse is somewhere in that direction. Nope, not at all. I spent probably half an hour aimlessly swinging on vines and falling back to the ground to climb up again before I finally noticed a second set of climbable vines next to where I came up the first time. Plus, there's not even enemies in the world yet to keep you engaged, though I guess that's also a benefit because fighting these guys a billion times would be mind-numbing. But okay, fine. I made it back to the treehouse. Clayton has a little moment, and now what? Should I go back to the camp? Oh, I guess that was right. Okay, fine, point to you, game. That felt less obvious than it was. But now I once again have no clue where to go. As it turns out, there is no real place to go. You just have to wander around the world fighting Heartless so a gorilla will stand in front of you motionless and give you an item. That's the only direction the game gave, so I guess I'll keep doing it. But couldn't there be some additional direction? Couldn't Jane just say, "Sora, the gorillas are in trouble, go see them, I'm from Great Britain," just so I can be sure that this is the right thing to do? Well, fine. Once you save them all, after backtracking to the treehouse again and then fight Sabor for the umpteenth time without any direction, we can see a cutscene where Jane is surrounded by Heartless. Oh no, better head on back. Sure enough, Jane is gone and at the treehouse again apparently. So after backtracking to the treehouse for a third time, you find Jane with a weird dark fruit that you're directed towards. Except you can't lock onto it, so it's hard to tell if you're actually supposed to hit it. Once you finish that, you can finally fight Clayton and his chameleon, jump around this cramped cave, and leave the level. Now let me be clear. None of that was completely game ruining, it was just very frustrating. Much like the coconut debacle or having to backtrack to Sid's, the game lacks important direction in key moments, or features frustrating level design with endless backtracking and continuous battling of the same enemy patterns. For this reason, I'd recommend that new players keep a guide handy when approaching for their first time. Not every level suffers from these problems. Wonderland is pretty straightforward, Olympus Coliseum is impossible to get lost in, Neverland is pretty small so it's easy to figure out, and the charm of Monstro is being at a maze. However, Deep Jungle is a mess as stated before, Agrabah has frustrating backtracking and confusing roadblocks put in the way, Halloween Town is rage-inducing platforming where a misstep means starting over from the bottom, and Atlantica... Don't even get me started on Atlantica. Actually, too late, here goes! Atlantica is the actual worst water level I've ever had the misfortune of playing, and that is saying something. You know how you've gotten used to the game's combat system? Well, too bad. All nuance goes out the window when your only combat options are to swing the Keyblade and cast magic. You now have to use clunky swimming controls that make it a pain to get anywhere, assuming you can actually figure out where you're supposed to go. There are multiple parts where you're told to go find something with zero direction. How am I supposed to know to grab onto this dolphin when it only swims by me during combat so I can't see the command pop up? It's asinine! The story is absolutely ridiculous. King Triton inexplicably knows about the Keyblade wielder and the keyhole, but keeps you from sealing it even though he knows that will protect the world from the Heartless. It's a ridiculous obstacle made for fake tension. After awkwardly swimming around for actual hours because this is the longest world, you finally fight Ursula in the most annoying, worst boss fight in the whole game. Also, you have to listen to Under the Sea the entire time, to the point where you're actually hanging on the last shreds of your sanity. I don't care if you can technically skip this level, that's not a valid excuse. Everything about this level is ill-advised and frustrating, and it goes on for so goddamn long. Why would they make this? Sorry, I kinda lost myself there. I wouldn't even mind these problems so much if they weren't easily fixable. A good example of a moment where confusion is avoided is when Aladdin yells for you to go to the desert after Jasmine gets captured. This kind of integration of direction isn't always needed, but it still has to be there. I feel like nobody playtested these levels because it feels like these gaps in understanding would naturally come up. Just throw a little more text in these boxes and it'd all be fine. It's not like that's the only fix, but none of these problems feel difficult to solve. Except for Atlantica. The other issue with the levels is their ordering, or lack thereof. On a conceptual level, I appreciate that the game allows the player to choose which world they'd like to tackle first. There's a recommended order shown in a difficulty scale, but there are many choices that the player can make instead. For example, doing Deep Jungle before either Wonderland or Olympus Coliseum can provide certain benefits. You can get a longer Keyblade, which makes the boss in Wonderland easier, or you can get a Cure Spell, which makes surviving the Coliseum and beating Cloud much easier. But you have to choose one advantage or the other. However, there's still a risk as you'd be approaching Deep Jungle at a lower level, making it more difficult. I appreciate the notion of allowing the player to make these risk-reward choices in an RPG, but the cracks begin to show the more the player strays from the ordered difficulty scale. For example, say you do the Coliseum first, followed by Deep Jungle to get the long Keyblade for Wonderland. At the end of Deep Jungle, the villains are shown to already have kidnapped Alice, but when you go back to Wonderland, she's back, only to be kidnapped again. You have to do Agrabah before any of the other worlds, meaning Riku's shift towards villainhood is in order, but the player could potentially skip Atlantica, and be justified in doing so, and get to the Jolly Roger ship early so this change doesn't have enough time to set in. It's not a huge deal overall, but the pacing that the game sets up shouldn't be so shallow. So yes, the player can make certain choices on how they want to tackle the worlds, but at the expense of consistency within the story. It's kind of weird that they put so much effort into these character arcs only to allow the player to break them, even if it's only a little bit. It's tough because again, I really like the conceptual elements of this idea, and I think they should exist, but not at any cost. I feel like there's gotta be a way to reorder the levels or provide more stops to force the player to engage the story in the right order, or at the very least, even out the pacing by letting the player's choice matter even more, like letting the player choose one world or the other instead of letting them skip a world to even out the pacing. As it stands, it doesn't feel like much thought was put into how the system would actually work. Speaking of something that's good in concept but didn't have much thought put into how it would actually work, Kingdom Hearts represents Square's first foray out of turn-based combat and into real-time combat, and the results are mixed. Rather than mapping different commands to different buttons, everything is mapped to the X button. In the bottom left of the screen is a list of different commands: attack, magic, use an item, cast a summon, plus a context-sensitive button. In the final mixed version of the game, that one is changed to the triangle button. In order to activate one of these commands, you have to scroll down to the option and press the X button. Mapping most everything to the X button has drastic consequences to how playing the game actually feels. Now, I've taken more time by this point to fully learn the game's combat system and utilize it to its full effect, but I'm reviewing this game from the perspective of a newcomer, as a first-time player. From that perspective, the combat in this game was fun, but monotonous. For almost every fight, I just mashed the X button on attack and pressed square to dodge when necessary. The only magic I used for the most part was the Cure Spell, which I mapped to L1 plus X, meaning I wouldn't have to scroll down to any other commands or stop mashing the X button. I only used other spells when absolutely necessary. I never used any of the stronger abilities since using them would require more MP, which I needed to cast infinite Cure Spells. Playing the game this way, mashing the X button the whole time and only dodging rather than parrying, is entirely possible, even if at times it's difficult, but it's definitely not the right way to play the game. It's tedious and uninteresting, even if it's entertaining. It's not terrible, it still requires attention and learning enemy attack patterns, but it's not entirely engaging. The combat system in this game gives more depending on how much you put into it. In my first playthrough, I didn't put much into it and I didn't get much out of it, but that doesn't mean that that'll be the case with all players. Mastering magic and special abilities makes the game easier, more engaging, and more fun. Figuring out which abilities work best in which part of the game can actually be really rewarding. This becomes most evident during the boss fights and the last third of the game. Here lies the problem with providing an infinite cure-all for the whole game. There isn't a scenario in the game that can't be beaten by attacking and dodging. You don't need to use magic to attack from a distance when Keyblade attacks have enough range on their own. You might cause yourself some misery by launching yourself off a cliff, but by the time these types of situations arise, it's hard to get out of set patterns. While yes, there is nothing to stop the player from engaging with various systems, it shouldn't necessarily be on the player to make the game fun. The game should be fun all on its own. To do that, it's necessary to push the player to step out from the simplest mechanics. In other words, design an enemy that can't be beaten by mashing X and dodging. There are a few enemies like this in the secret bosses, but that's not enough. Turn-based Square games would have ways to make the player switch things up by having enemies buff themselves or debuff you. It's possible to debuff enemies if you use stop, but the enemies don't do anything of the sort to you. There are fire attacks, ice attacks, and the like, but there's no fire damage or ice damage or anything of that sort. There are only attacks that do more or less damage. It's not really fair to expect the player to engage with the game when the game doesn't engage with itself. Again, this game can be really fun when strategy is applied, but the game should require strategy to be used more often. As it stands, the gameplay is kind of just fine. Genuinely fun systems at play here, but much like with the level design, not much thought as to how to implement them. I give this game a little bit of slack in this regard since this was squarely out of the dev's comfort zone, and this game could in many ways be seen as more of an experiment rather than a fully understood venture. I respect the attempt, but it's clear that a little more care had to be taken. This game wanted to be the next Mario 64, but it doesn't take the same care that that game does when it comes to pushing the player to think outside of the box. This game exists entirely within an area of comfort, making it perfectly entertaining but outwardly dull. That said, given that getting better at the gameplay makes the game more fun, it's infinitely replayable. Now, onto the real good stuff. Pretty much all of the issues I've had with the game dissipate in the final act. It's not like enemy encounters get much more complex, but there's enough weight behind them to compensate. The battles become engaging on their own, even if you're not fully engaging with the diverse combat system. After arriving at Hollow Bastion, Maleficent's lair, Riku reveals that Sora actually isn't the Keyblade Master and takes it from him. Everything comes to a head, with Riku seemingly getting the upper hand in his competition with Sora for good this time, and with Donald and Goofy abandoning their friends so that they can continue to follow the Keyblade wielder. It's hard to imagine a lower point for either Sora or the player. Everything is stripped away from you at once, leaving you all the more determined to get it back. Teaming up with the Beast, Sora makes his way into the castle. He faces off with Riku, determined to fight him even if there's no hope left. And determined to stick by their friend, Donald and Goofy return to his side. With the confidence of having his friends with him, the strength of Sora's heart overpowers Riku, causing the Keyblade to return to him before dueling Riku. I personally love how easy this fight is, as it reinforces how your strength of heart comes from your friends. With them, there's no chance that someone like Riku could beat you. And this is just the beginning of Hollow Bastion. We're just getting started. Riku finds the hooded figure from the beginning of the game and gives himself over to him so that he might be able to gain the power to beat Sora. I love this because it shows how Riku's interest has become so skewed. It might have started with wanting to save Kairi, but it's become just about beating Sora, his self-imposed rival. The climactic Riku fight might actually be with his possessor, but it still works as it stems from his most evil action thus far. Sora climbs the castle as Maleficent attempts to use the power of the Princesses of Heart to open Kingdom Hearts, which fails due to one of the princesses being missing. Upon reaching the top of the castle, the trio faces off with Maleficent and beats her, causing her to retreat. Riku, or rather the mysterious figure who's taken over Riku, uses the Keyblade capable of opening the darkness in one's heart to stab Maleficent and unleash her darkness form, that of a dragon. The trio takes it down, revealing that she's been nothing but a puppet for the Heartless all along. Riku corners Sora and reveals that Kairi is the final Princess of Heart necessary for unlocking Kingdom Hearts. In order to open Kingdom Hearts, Kairi's heart must be returned to her. The only issue is that it's currently held within Sora and has been since the Heartless appeared on Destiny Islands. He also reveals his true identity, Ansem, the Seeker of Darkness. Sora and Riksum face off for Kairi's heart. Sora prevails, but still understands that Kairi's heart must be returned. With that in mind, he takes the Darkness Keyblade and uses it on himself, releasing the princess's hearts, including Kairi's, and turning himself into a Heartless. Ansem comes back to open Kingdom Hearts and kill the rest of the Disney trio, but Riku holds onto his body just long enough to allow an escape. Kairi, Donald, and Goofy all flee the castle, but upon coming across Sora's Heartless, Kairi manages to bring him back from the realm of darkness with the power of love. With all that done, the group finally leaves Hollow Bastion. Arguably, my favorite part of this whole climactic section of the game is the reveals, or more specifically, how they've been foreshadowed. Every big moment in Hollow Bastion is projected well in advance. Riku being the real Keyblade wielder is shown in a flashback to when he could see Destiny Island's keyhole when Sora couldn't. Kairi being a princess from Hollow Bastion is shown in a memory of her grandmother taking place in the castle library. The ability to bring hearts stolen from the Heartless back to someone through your love for them is shown in Monstro, when Jiminy Cricket saves Pinocchio. I love these moments because they're not brought up during the reveals. It's up to the player to put the pieces together themselves, rather than get spoon-fed the information forcefully. The momentum remains completely uninterrupted. It's not like everything is crystal clear. I still don't understand how Ansem was able to unlock Kingdom Hearts despite Sora freeing the princesses and stealing the keyhole later on, but despite some narrative confusion, thematically, everything is crystal clear, due in large part to the stakes being well set up beforehand. When you boil it down to its simplest factors, a story of good versus evil, it can be pretty inspiring. And we're not even at the end of the world yet, but one step at a time. Hollow Bastion is also a perfectly constructed level. It's straightforward with enough areas off the beaten path to explore. People freak out over the lift stops, but they're genuinely not as complicated as they're cracked up to be. Besides, the general direction that you're meant to head in is always the same: up. It's tough to get lost in this level, which again allows for the momentum to flow uninterrupted, aided by probably the best track in the whole game. Using lessons you learn from other levels makes this one more fun, but there's even more to learn within this level itself that makes the last chunk more interesting. For example, there are these treasure chests on elevated platforms scattered throughout the level. As they are, it's impossible to open them, but by using the gravity spell you can lower the platform and open the chests. This is a helpful trick to learn for the first Maleficent boss, as she spends the fight on a floating block which you can collapse with gravity. Giving the player all the tools to figure these things out for themselves without spelling it all out for them leads to a more satisfying experience. It's a massive level with tons of different unique design aspects to test out and play around with, making for easily the most thrilling level in the game, taking negatives from before and burying them through purely positive aspects, or just fully fixing them. The threats, themes, and story arcs all build to their most thrilling points, and we're not even at the end yet. End of the World wound up taking me by surprise, solidifying the best aspects of the game that I hadn't fully realized yet. Sora, Donald, and Goofy pursue Ansem to a sort of nexus of worlds that have lost their hearts and died, leading to the remnants of Destiny Islands. They all face off, ending in a giant battle in front of the massive doors of Kingdom Hearts. By holding the thoughts of his friends close to him, Sora manages to prevail against Ansem. In one final bid for power, Ansem opens the doors, expecting to achieve supreme darkness. However, remembering Kairi's memory from before, Sora proclaims that Kingdom Hearts is light, which erupts outward and kills Ansem. With the help of Riku and King Mickey on the other side of the doors, they manage to shut them and lock them for good. With Kingdom Hearts of Worlds sealed, the worlds begin to separate once again, causing Sora and Kairi to become once again separated. Sora reassures her and says that he'll find a way to come back to her before they are torn apart. In the end, Sora, Donald, and Goofy head down an unknown path, chasing the continuing mysteries and adventures of their universe. Barring the elements that I loved in Hollow Bastion and that remain great here, End of the World brought potentially Kingdom Hearts' best aspect to light, that being its masterful use of the RPG format. The best part of RPGs is how they can scale. The threats you fight in Endgame are bound to be significantly more serious due to your substantial rise in power. The final boss might not have the emotional connection that the Hollow Bastion fights have, but he has scale for days. Fighting Ansem makes the days where large bodies pose the challenge feel like pure fiction. This is the power that an RPG can have, especially when aimed at younger audiences. Well-implemented power fantasy. It's exciting to face off against such a world-ending threat as an adult. I can only imagine what this would have been like for me as a kid. Kingdom Hearts is like a gateway drug for RPGs. It might not have the greatest highs out there, but it's universally effective at what it's doing. Also, don't do drugs. Despite its flaws, the game's conclusion cemented itself in my mind as a thrilling adventure. If I were to rate this game in the first two-thirds, it likely wouldn't be all that good of a score, but I'd be lying if I said that the ending didn't improve things. If you're thinking about playing this game and seeing what all the hype is about, make sure you play it through to the end. It's not the shortest game ever, clocking in at around 28 hours, but it has tremendous payoff, even when compared to many of its contemporaries. I'd be doing the game a disservice if I judged it without mentioning all the post-game content, but before that, I should address a minor complaint that you can't keep the XP gained during the final battle. Any level ups reached after the final rest don't carry over after the credits, which is genuinely annoying. That said, the bonus content here is well worth the time to grind. For one, there's the Coliseum tournaments and 100 Acre Woods levels, which you may complete during the main story. These are fun minigames that test the player in different ways, or at the very least have Winnie the Pooh, which is great in and of itself. Completing these extras will net you rare synthesis items which you can use on your path towards forging the Ultima weapon, the game's most powerful keyblade. On top of all of that, there are the game's secret bosses, aka the most interesting enemies in the game. There's Agrabah's Kurt Zisa, Neverland's Phantom, the Coliseum's Ice Titan and Sephiroth, and the final mix-only mysterious figure in Hollow Bastion. These enemies require thought and strategy that other enemies don't. Kurt Zisa periodically cuts off either your physical or magical attacks, meaning that you have to be well prepared in both regards. You can't just rely on matching X here or using cures to stay alive. Phantom only holds one vulnerability at a time in an endurance match where losing focus means having allies fall without joining back in. Ice Titan forces you to master parry moves as well as dodge moves in an intense fight that divides your attention. Finally, Sephiroth and the mysterious figure tie everything together in an ultimate test of skills. While these fights don't have the story significance or scale of the endgame fights, they present the greatest challenge and the most satisfying victories. Being Sephiroth and the mysterious figure on Proud Mode is actually one of my proudest gaming moments, not because it's the hardest thing in the world, but because it took hard work and focus to do. With everything in the main story and the post-game content together, I'd personally say this game is well worth the current price tag on PS4, or PS2 if you have one. My final score for Kingdom Hearts is a solid 6 out of 10. It's by no means a perfect game, its flaws are too widespread to fully ignore. For that reason, I would recommend avoiding it if you've already played enough RPGs to determine that you're not a big fan of them. For fans of RPGs, I would recommend playing it at least once so you might form your own opinion. I do believe that it's better on replay due to mastery of mechanics, so I would say try and engage with the game as much as you can. While it may not push you in that direction as much as it should, it's well worth the effort for a more captivating experience. Finally, for who this game is really for, play the game if you've yet to get into RPGs, but you're looking to get into them. It's an undemanding, simple game for newbies that presents a thrilling enough adventure to convince someone of what makes RPGs so cool. If you've made it this far, I just want to say thank you. I've wanted to make this for a long time, and while I don't expect viewership to be too high, it means a lot that you sat through it. I'd like to make more nostalgia-free reviews in the future, including Kingdom Hearts 2 naturally. So if you would be interested in hearing more of my unclouded thoughts on beloved games, then maybe subscribe. Again, thanks for taking the time to check this out, and I hope to see you again soon. Take care.